Second Amendment rights are important. There are other rights that we care about as well. Our unalienable right to life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, those rights were stripped from college kids in Blacksburg and Santa Barbara, and from high schoolers at Columbine, and from first graders in Newtown, and from every family who never imagined that their loved one would be taken from our lives by a bullet from a gun. And by the way, it happens on the streets of Chicago every day.
All right, so today I'm going to be discussing a very important but serious topic, and that is gun control and gun violence. As I sit here today, there has been at least 268 mass shootings, as well as 17,500 people unalive this past year due to those mass shootings. And at the rate we are going as a country, we are set to pass not only the record for mass shootings in 2021, but we are set to have double the mass shootings as there are days in a year. Even for the past few years, firearm violence has been the #1 cause of death in children, surpassing car accidents in 2019. And even after recent tragedies such as the Metro Atlanta shooting, as well as the Allen Mall shootings, 2 of which hit personally close to home, we are still stuck in this mindless debate about whether or not guns are still the issue, or is it just mental health? Is it just our society, or this, that, and the third? But even as gun control and gun rights have become a hotly contested debate, even after Sandy Hook in 2012, I believe there's a much bigger problem that we need to address that pertains not only to just America's history, but to America's gun culture and how it has evolved throughout our history. I believe in my heart that this needs to be a long, complex one, because we are facing a long, complex history. Today's video is also not for the faint of heart. We're going to be talking about a lot of different triggers, a lot of different topics, a lot of different isms, a lot of different, points. If you're not up to watching this video, I will implore you to please click off. I won't judge you, because your health, matters the most to me. But at the end of the day, this is your first and final warning about how dark this video might get. All right, so to really unpack about how our gun culture really has evolved, we need to go way, way, way back to the Revolutionary War era. Basically, for a good chunk of the country's history, especially during this time period, America and the American colonies, to be exact, was seen as a very agrarian society where, you would farm, but you will also hunt for your food as well. During this time, firearms really didn't have their own separate culture in America, because pretty much they were only seen as tools to be used during hunting, or they were used in self-defense. And most of the time, it wasn't really self-defense against other Americans or other colonists, but they were more so used for self-defense against Native Americans, or quote-unquote self-defense, because we all know that was pretty much a lie. But nonetheless, we didn't have this big imagery about guns being a simple part of American freedom. They were simply used as tools, such as you would use a hammer, or you would use nails. It's just stuff you would use as necessary, and there's nothing more to it. And because of this train of thought, many researchers have stated that the earliest forms of gun control actually came before the country was even founded. Basically, the first formal legislative body of European settlers in North America, which was in Jamestown, basically founded about 30 different laws, as well as amendments in 1619, detailing the first ever gun control, legislation that would hit the North American region. And basically, a quote from one of those legislations says that no man do or sell or give any Indians or Native Americans back at that time any piece of shot, powder, or any arms offensive or defensive upon pain of being held a traitor to the colonies and of being hanged as soon as the fact is proven, without all redemption. And so basically, gun control was started to seen as a necessary tool, not necessarily just to keep guns out of the hands of bad colonists or indentured servants, but it was starting to seen as a tool to keep them out of the hands of Native Americans, because during that time it was very profitable to trade with Native Americans for different wares, as well as for different foods and medicines and all that, but they still wanted to keep them defenseless to the point where if they needed to trample over them, they were be able to do that, swiftly, and gun control was the best way to do that. And really just going further into the late 1700s, there also has been extensive gun laws throughout the newly formed United States that pretty much required all able-bodied men to not only purchase their own, weapons with powders, with ammos and all that, but they would pretty much have to have them mustered as well as inspected on a regular basis or frequent basis, because pretty much they require all able-bodied men to be part of the Citizens Militia. Citizens Militia was a quote-unquote volunteer group of citizens, usually mostly men, who volunteered their time as well as their weapons to the good of the Republic if the time ever came. Like if there was another invasion, like if Native Americans, rose up and tried to take over like a city, then the Citizens Militias would have been activated. And so to really get a good idea about how many weapons or how many firearms were in the US, you would probably look at the Citizens Militias, public records, which were very hard to find. Many researchers have also estimated that about 50% of wealth holders in colonies owned weapons at this time. And so pretty much you kind of get the idea that weapons were very common. What was also popular was gun control, because outside of just the Second Amendment giving you the rights to bear arms, a lot of people still understood that guns were a very much dangerous tool that had to be heavily regulated, or at least they wanted it to be heavily regulated, because they just came out of war with Great Britain. Like, they don't just want those weapons out on the streets willy-nilly every day. And so there has been a lot of talk about which state was the first state to really implement gun control, but many researchers have pointed to Kentucky to be a model and being the first state to be able to actually implement their own form of gun control. The first gun control act was the 1813 bill to bar the concealed carry of firearms in public, which is kind of ironic into seeing how Kentucky is today, but I digress. Another state that was said to have enacted gun control rights pretty much early in the Republic is Massachusetts, as in 1837, Massachusetts passed a law that prohibited carrying of a handgun unless a person had a very specific reason for doing so. But just how gun control was often racialized and marginalized already oppressed groups, this is a thing that's going to continue not only in the Revolutionary War period, but also throughout the entire history of America. Because not only were Native Americans barred from trading weapons, powder, ammunitions with colonists for different wares and stuff like that, they started adding freed black men as well as slaves to these, gun control acts. And there's some of the early slave codes as well as black codes, which were laws that targeted only black people. Many of these codes often barred black people from owning firearms, because as in 1833, a Georgia law has stated that it shall not be lawful for any free person of color in the state to own, use, or carry firearms of any description whatever, and that free person of color so detected in owning, using, and carrying said firearm shall receive upon his bare back 39 lashes, and that the firearm so found in the possession of said free person of color shall be exposed for public sale. And when you get past the fact that a lot of these acts were very much racist and should have never been, enacted, it still showed in a way that these colonists knew weapons were not to be messed with. They weren't toys. They weren't, something you can just tote around in public. These were weapons of mass destruction that weren't supposed to be used by certain people. It still shows that they had the thought process like, we need to make sure we restrict them as much as possible so they don't fall into quote unquote wrong hands. These weren't just playthings that you can just tote around, carry to the range and all that. These are literally like tools that you need to only use if absolutely necessary when hunting or self-defense. Be going towards the post-antebellum South as well as the Wild Wild West periods, because these are two cultural, high points that really shifted the way we viewed guns in America. So first, going to the post-antebellum South, basically we're going to be talking about Reconstruction era, basically the time where Union troops right after the Civil War actually occupied the South to not only restrict the Confederate government from ever rising again, but also to make sure that the, freed slaves as well as like free black people down in the South were able to hold the political power that they just gained after the war. And when you consider the fact that most white men today hate the fact of not only diversity, equity, and inclusion, but also when someone forces it down their throat, i.e. affirmative action, then you understand that a lot of white men back in the day were not going for this. Very much so that after they were demobilized after losing the war, a lot of Confederate veterans, which is about at least 500,000 white men, came back to the South and found that it wasn't what it used to be. They decided to do something with it. And that wouldn't be really much a big issue. But when you consider the fact that a lot of white, Confederate veterans took their service weapons and service pistols after they demobilized and just took them back to where they came from, then you understand the problem that will soon arise. Because now you will start seeing weapons and firearms to not only be used as tools of self-defense and hunting, but they are now tools to enact political intimidation onto not only black people, but also to people coming from the North, which were the Union soldiers. Take one such incident, such as the 1866 massacre at the Mechanic Institute in New Orleans, where black marchers were simply trying to march and protest against the expansion of black codes, which also expanded during this time to include more and more gun control measures against black people, but also to be able to have the ability to vote, but also want to march against codes that limit their ability to vote. Outside the Mechanics Institute's doors, these marchers were not only ambushed, but basically they were shot at and chased down by white supremacists and ex-Confederates trying to intimidate them from standing up for their rights. A total of 150 people died during this incident, and 44 of them being African American. Another incident that highlights the prevalence of white violence against black bodies is the Wilmington Massacre of 1898. In 1898, white supremacists not only deposed the democratically elected government of Wilmington, North Carolina, which was not only just elected recently during the Reconstruction era, but it was predominantly integrated with a black alderman who was also deposed in this incident. But they basically ran that alderman and several thousand black people out of Wilmington, all the while burning many different buildings, even the first black-owned news press in that town, in the name of self-defense. Go figure. If those two incidents flew over your head, then let's talk about the Battle of Liberty Point, which is also coined the overthrowing of New Orleans in 1874, where 5,000 white supremacists walked into New Orleans to depose the newly democratically elected governor of Louisiana, who was a Republican at the time, or which was the Union basically, and got into a gunfight with state militia and police. And while they only controlled New Orleans for 3 days, after that the Union came in and swiftly took back the town. This really highlights that guns are starting to be used for not only just for racist purposes, but also acts of domestic terrorism. Like basically the stuff they did on January 6th of 2021, they did this back in the day, and this is stuff that pretty much a lot of Americans don't really know about. And what gets me is that people have this misconception that, oh, this is new to MAGA, this is, time we're in, when there's literally records in history that shows that insurgencies like this have taken place throughout many different points in history, and the main focal point of these insurgencies are weapons. Now, that is not to say that all weapons are bad or weapons are inherently bad. It takes bad people to really just, use weapons as a means to their devious ends. But at the end of the day, with them having easy access to weapons right after being demobilized from the Civil War, it literally is just one of those things, I can't really fathom. And while you can't really account for every weapon in the South, a recent study looked at the correlation of wherever slaves populated versus the predictability of gun owners being in the proximity And it found that areas with the highest amount of enslaved people had the highest amount of gun owners. And even when they took into account of other predictors such as crime, miseducation, unemployment, and all that, this was as high as a predictor of gun ownership as counties, or a percentage of counties that were, predicted to vote for Donald Trump in 2016. Go figure. But what really should stick out to you is that a lot of this rhetoric was done under the guise of self-defense, and they were trying to defend their families, they were trying to defend their honor, they were trying to defend their land, and they were trying to get their way of life back, and they were going to do it by any means necessary. And I kid you not, basically on the day of the Wilmington massacre, there was a declaration of white independence declared by the mob. And basically the mob essentially said that we, the undersigned citizens, do hereby declare that we will no longer be ruled and will never again be ruled by the men of African origin. Like, I can't make this stuff up for y'all folks. Like, it's literally written down in history. Now, to switch gears, let's talk about the Wild Wild West, or at least the mystified version of the Wild Wild West for a minute. Because basically, I know we all grew up to, seeing cowboys, riding on horses, trying to save the damsel in distress, or two outlaws duking it out in the dead heat of summer in a high stakes duel, or really just the strong imagery of just a lawless frontier where, murders were happening, bank robberies and train robberies were happening left and right, and basically the authorities couldn't really get a handle of what's going on in the West. A lot of this imagery is depicted in a lot of old Western movies and shows such as Gunsmoke, but a lot of these are still carry over in today's medium, such as the Yellowstone series and all its numerous, spin-offs that's happening with it. But here's the thing, and I'm sorry if I'm the one to bust anybody's bubble, but a lot of that stuff is often dramatized and mystified. Because you see, during this time period, many people fantasize about manifest destiny and going across uncharted lands, going into, mining towns, striking it rich with gold, having a ranch, cattle, and all that. And a lot of times this imagery is accompanied with guns, because a lot of gun companies saw this as a gold mine in itself to market their weapons, because many people became so much fascinated with this mystique of the cowboy. But the reality of the Wild Wild West is that it wasn't as crazy as many Hollywood productions will have you to think. Now, don't get me wrong, the Wild Wild West is still a very dangerous place. Like, literally, you're going across uncharted lands, you're going across, unknown territory where you had to go fight against not only nature, but also Native Americans who you were encroaching on their land technically, but it was still a dangerous place nonetheless for a settler. And so their main choice of weapon was the firearm or guns. But many researchers and many historians have came out and said that gun violence was actually pretty rare in the Wild Wild West. And while there were hot spots, especially in mining and railroad towns where, a lot of stuff popped off, it wasn't like this big action, triple A, Hollywood bonanza that many people will like you to believe. Like, it was actually pretty tamed. Like, people weren't just going into towns and shooting saloons up for nothing. And while a lot of historians have also said that homicide rates might be a lot higher in the Wild Wild West than in some places in the US today, you have to understand that when you have such a small population, which made up a lot of these, Western towns, then basically one murder will really jump the homicide rate up a lot of figures, basically. Like, many towns in the Wild Wild West had less than 2,000 people in them at some point, and literally, like, if you had one big shootout where 5 people were unalive and that was the only big thing that popped off in your town in that year, then of course you're gonna have a high homicide rate, but it doesn't tell the whole picture. And in a sense, while even going deep into the research, it is kind of common sense that, a lot of stuff wasn't popping off in the Wild Wild West, because if you had shootouts, train robberies, bank robberies, and basically all this debauchery going on a daily basis, then basically no one would have moved out to the West, and we probably wouldn't have populated many of the mining towns we had today. Like, no one in their right mind would have taken a risk to even try to go strike it out big with gold, because they probably wouldn't have been able to enjoy those riches long enough before getting unalived by another, outlaw. Another big thing that Hollywood often likes to gloss over about the Wild Wild West was that they had pretty much a lot of gun control laws. And While there's very much varied amount of enforcements because pretty much a lot of these gun laws required you to be on an honor system, nonetheless, they still had the thought to at least implement these laws because, hey, maybe it doesn't make sense for everyone to be toting around a weapon, especially in front of family, women, children, as well as maybe you shouldn't be carrying a weapon while you're going to the saloon and getting wasted. Some of those famous as well infamous towns in the Wild Wild West, depending on how you look at them, Tombstone, Arizona, as well as Dawes City, has some of the most strict gun laws to, date in the Wild Wild West. And so I'll bring this topic up because many politicians have the habit of, talking about our current circumstances when it comes to crime, debauchery, as well as, gun and lawlessness as being known as the Wild Wild West, when the reality of the situation is the Wild Wild West was pretty much more tame than what we're seeing today, if we're going to be honest. But nonetheless, this warped perception of not only the Wild Wild West being a, dangerous, being this ravenous place, as well as the fact that, white supremacists were using guns in the name of self-defense, but really to further their ideologies, is because guns are starting to not being looked as just tools of self-defense as well as hunting and gathering, but now guns are starting to be personified as tools of getting across individuals, own ideologies and, selfish purposes, whether it be racism or anti-government rhetoric or capitalism when it comes to gun companies trying to mystify the Wild Wild West to sell their own products. Heck, even the use of gun control is starting to become more personified as well as used and weaponized against oppressed populations. Because, for example, the KKK wasn't just the first domestic terrorist organization in the US, but it was also one of the biggest gun control organizations in the US, where they often tried to disarm freed black men and women, depending on the case, and basically try to disarm them before they came back and to what with them. And to really just unpack this further, it's really crazy to me that the people who will be very much gun rights, gun, Second Amendment, will probably have these same tendencies back in the day. Now let's get into the early 1900s. This is also a time period that's very much popularized in film with, Godfather, The Goodfellas, The Irishman, as well as a lot of other, modern shows such as Snowfall, just Power, Empire, some of my two favorites, as well as a lot of other, different shows that talk about crime and gang violence. And the biggest reason why organized crime popped off during this era was mainly due to Prohibition. Now, I've already done my own little video about that. I implore y'all to go watch that. That is a banger. But pretty much Prohibition was the banning of the consumption of alcohol and selling of alcohol pretty much everywhere in the US, which is very ironic that we had a national ban on alcohol before we even had a national ban on, firearms. But pretty much Prohibition gave way to bootlegging, basically illegally, shipping, making, as well as profiting off of alcohol, as well as speakeasies, which was a secret underground club that alcohol was, sold at, as well as many other criminal activities that associated with like prostitution, gambling, and, a lot of other different, things that I really can't discuss on YouTube. Now, these criminal activities became so popular and so profitable that in Chicago alone, $100 million was made off of bootlegging just in this time period. But when it comes to doing a lot of these illegal activities, a lot of other things, come with it, and a lot of that is gang competition, as well as just high stakes crime and murder. There's a lot of mass violent incidents as well as crime that took place during this time, such as the St. Valentine's Day massacre, which I'm not going to discuss because they have been very much popularized in American media. Definitely go look those up. But being America was definitely not sweet, because it was said even at one point the homicide rate was at least up to 12,000 people per year, in which that might not be a significant number to today's numbers, but it was a big deal back in that time period, because that was pretty much the first time crime was like on the rise in America. What also didn't help anybody during this time period was that now there was a rise of automatic machine guns going into the public, population. Now, most notably, the machine guns I'm talking about are the Thompson, as well as the BAR, the Browning automatic rifle, which were developed during World War I. Basically, the Thompson was developed by General John Thompson of the U.S. Army Ordnance, because he was looking at creating a weapon that soldiers could not only carry with them as they sweep trenches to trenches, but also that could have a high clip capacity to be able to clear out those trenches. He developed the Thompson, which was also known as the trench broom. And while media and film often like to romanticize this gun a lot of people didn't really buy it because it was just too expensive. Like, it was about, I think, $175 to about $227 a pop just to not only get the rifle, but there's also charging when it comes to trying to get into high capacity clips. This was also backed up by the fact that the pistol was still very much popular because not only could you conceal it, it was also, you know, more inexpensive and still did the most damage, or it was still very useful in the fact that, you know, you can still get the job done with a pistol. But nonetheless, companies still try to market the Thompson as just like the go-to plantation gun that you need to use to protect your land, you need to protect your family, protect your cattle and all that. It was also starting to be marketed towards kids. Now, not the real weapon, but they started marketing like the concept of the Thompson in like toys, you know, to kids heavily. And now not only are you starting to market a weapon of mass destruction to actual children, but you're starting to associate, you know, crime and gun with toys that kids can just buy and pick up and have like tons of fun with, you know? Because especially during the Great Depression, they started seeing outlaws, especially when you talk about Bonnie and Clyde, in a different light, because during this time, many people were very much outraged with the government because they felt like bankers on Wall Street really messed over the whole country. You're starting to see more popularized images of criminals such as Bonnie and Clyde gain much more favor with the American public and, you know, really trying to tickle our fancies with it. But one fixture I want to bring up that I feel like is not being talked about enough when we talk about this whole, you know, gun culture debate is the fact of Race Williams, which was a character that was prominently featured in the Black Mass magazine series. Basically, Race Williams was the early adaptation of the hardboiled PI trying to stick it out to the police, trying to solve every crime, try to, you know, be saving damsels in distress. The reason I bring him up is that this was kind of like the early adaptations after the cowboy, you know, archetype was developed, of course, of the good guy narrative. And even though he's not brought up as much as he was back then, he was the first, you know, embodiment of what a good guy with a gun looks like, where if we expand gun rights and allow, you know, everyday citizens to be able to carry weapons outside of being like law enforcement, then they will have the ability to stop, you know, bad guys with weapons, you know, before the police can do something about it. But nonetheless, there was still a lot of crime and there was still a lot of weapons that needed to be clamped down on. And so nonetheless, in 1934, President Roosevelt, as well as Congress, passed the National Firearms Act of 1934, which not only imposed a registration and tax for anyone wanting to have a certain type of weapon, especially when it comes to automatic weapons like Thompsons and the BARs, but anytime during the sale and transfer of these certain types of weapons, it was required that the new owner had to not only pay the tax, but they had to get photographed as well as get their fingerprint as well as a serial number of the weapon turned into the IRS, basically trying to get the first ever, you know, monitoring system for weapons in the US. And while there was a lot of good intentions with the act, it still came with a lot of pitfalls. One being that it excluded most weapons in the US, which were handguns. And when you consider the fact that most crimes, even during that time, are conducted by handguns, then you will understand that this is a huge oversight in what could have been very, you know, monumental legislation, because pretty much it still allowed many individuals, criminals, and law-abiding citizens to go unregistered and unnoticed in the system. And the funny part about this act is that a year before, there was another bill to outline the same things and the same measures, but also included handguns within that, you know, act. And the thing about it, it was not pushed through Congress because many people knew that many, you know, gun owners in the U.S. weren't going to be, you know, willing to like register or like get taxed for their weapons. The NRA, which was oddly enough a gun control organization before the 1970s, literally lobbied against this act because, and I quote from the NRA vice president of the time, Redford, "A pistol or revolver is not dangerous. It is only dangerous in the hands of a crook. Honest citizens won't obey a pistol registration requirement, and you're going to legislate 15 million sportsmen into criminals. with a stroke of the president's pen. Like, they literally lobbied against this act because they didn't want everyday citizens to be held accountable for their weapons, which most people literally probably would have been fine with doing it, because I think most Americans have common sense that, hey, maybe we shouldn't have millions and millions of guns unregistered in the population. And I get that you're not going to get every weapon in the population. There's still going to be weapons that are going to be seen by illegal means. But the point of this act was to try and get as many weapons as possible registered, so that way we have less and less weapons out in circulation in the public that goes unregistered and could be potentially be untraceable and used in crimes. And another big reason why the NRA and a lot of big, gun, rights advocates were lobbying against this is that they felt like this was the first step into not only just monitoring or restricting what weapons get put into circulation, but also this will be a step towards disarming the entirety of the United States and come under some type of dictatorship, which I really don't need research or factual information to really back this up. Like, no person, whether it be an Army Marine or a lonely district attorney in your county, is willing to come into your house and try to take your weapon. Like, that is one of the biggest death wish you can wish on anybody, and you have a better chance of seeing Michael Jackson coming and moonwalking from the grave than really anybody willing to fulfill that order. Now, to get back on topic, the act that succeeded the National Firearms Act of 1934 was the Federal Firearms Act of 1938. This act not only deemed it illegal for gun sellers to sell weapons to certain populations, including felons, but it required that federally licensed gun sellers had to maintain customer records. Now, this is very much pivotal because it sets the precedent for the federal background checking system that comes into play in the next section. But pretty much it still fell short, because when you consider that most gun sellers are private individuals who are not federally licensed, this doesn't really put a big dent into the whole guns going unrestricted or guns going unregulated as a whole argument. All right, so now we're going to roll into the 1960s, which was a very wild time in American history. One way I want to highlight this is that we are now starting to get into the modern era of mass unalivings, basically with the UT Tower shooting. Basically, a gunman climbed the clock tower of the University of Texas, which is my alma mater, and basically unalive about 17 people and injured about 30 other folks in the rampage. This event alone not only sparked national attention when it comes to mass unalivings, but when you think about the 60s, we've had a lot of gun violence that took place with the assassinations of JFK, RFK, and MLK, just to name a few. And also, to add fuel on the fire, there was also the beginning of the early culture wars when you talk about the counterculture as well as the silent majority, especially when it comes to issues such as civil rights as well as the Vietnam War. And with fears that the country was falling apart, there was also the fear that there was many different guns coming around in circulation, as well as violent crimes was also on the rise even in the 70s. President Lyndon B. Johnson, even in '69, commissioned a group to look more into how much gun ownership had evolved over time in the U.S. And in 1969, the commission even filed a report that stated that they found about 90 million guns in the U.S., many of them handguns and many of them unregulated. And so all this fear spurred not only Congress, but also President Johnson to put words into action. And basically in 1968, they were able to pass the Gun Control Act. Now, the GSA not only regulates interstate commerce as it pertains to federally licensed gun dealers, this act also restricted more and more people from actually owning weapons, now including not only more felons, but also drug users. And while this was very much still a win in many people's eyes because this continues to restrict private sales of guns, this didn't do much for a lot of gun sales that happen within state boundaries and not, considered interstate commerce. Because the definition of a private sale can be as loose as me going to my neighbor and asking to buy a Ruger or a Colt 21 or whatever. I don't know my guns. But basically, it could be as easy as just doing that, and that would be considered a private sale. The act also fell short with not only having a national registry to register all guns, including the handguns, in which, like I said, they should have done in the 30s, but I digress. but also required that all gun sellers, no matter private sellers or federal licensed sellers, had to be licensed to participate in a gun transaction, basically meaning that, you know, all sellers had to record customer records. And a lot of this was prevented being a provision in law, not only due to the NRA lobbying, which, you know, NRA didn't really have gun control when it came to the Black Panthers in the Milford Act of 1967, but I'm not going to be petty right now. And now going to the 80s and 90s, in which the 70s rise in crime really, you know, went 0 to 100 literally in the 80s, especially as it intersects with the crack epidemic. There's also a steep rise in homicides in the US. And a lot of this really stoked fear into the American public that, you know, it was an unsafe place, and really started to change the perceptions about guns and like using them as self-defense. But what kicked it up a notch was the attempted assassination of President Reagan, as well as Assistant Press Secretary James Brady. But before we really go into the gun control laws of this time period, I really want to talk about the different themes and notion that was going on during this time. The first thing I want to talk about is this commentary on Black crime as well as hip hop culture.
Here's Wonder Mike, Hank, and Master G, the Sugar Hill Gang.
The hip, how you don't stop. Rock it out, baby, rubber to the boogity bang bang, the boogie to the boogity beat.
Now, rap music and hip hop music has been a staple of the Black community since the 70s, and it really gained prominence in the 80s and 90s because it not only just started to turn into like, you know, mystical flows, but pretty much it started turning into like a commentary on the plight of urban Black people, especially, you know, when it comes to the crack epidemic. But what was seen as poetry by many Black people, a lot of white people, especially conservative white people, saw this as like debauchery, saw this as degradation of American values, and basically saying that, you know, this was a reason why crime was so prevalent in the Black community. This is the reason why crime is prevalent on a rise now, and this, that, and the third. And that's something I really want to debunk, because yes, I get, you know, music, rap music, and especially today's rap culture really, you know, is a bad influence on kids. I just want to let you know that is not the cause of why crime is still, you know, happening, as well as why crime was going off the rails in the 80s. Crime is a direct result of people's social conditions, especially when you talk about poverty. And yes, not all Black people grew up in poverty. Yes, most white people in America grow up in poverty. But what we're talking about and what rap music has talked about is that Black people and the conditions that Black people have grown up around in, most of us have grown up in a condition of concentrated poverty that is very traumatic. But what I want to say is that people are not committing crimes because they listen to TK or Young Thug or, you know, Lil Weezy, whatever, on the radio and decided to go commit a crime. People are more likely to commit a crime now as well as back then due to their social condition that they found themselves in. But the misconception about Black crime, as well as like Black violence, as well as the crack epidemic in the 80s in general, have been used as talking points not by conservative Republicans but also conservative Democrats, i.e. Joe Biden and Bill Clinton, you know, basically to not only expand the use of guns. And this is how we're going to segue into the AR-15, because pretty much the AR-15 was pretty much under the radar before, you know, the 80s and 70s. Basically, it was seen as this unattractive gun that was made out of black aluminum and plastic that not even the military wanted to use during their campaigns. However, during the Vietnam War, its counterpart, which was the M16, the military variant of the AR-15, basically saw a lot of prominence and was issued as the main service rifles, or one of the main service rifles during their campaign. The hype the M16 got was the same hype that the AR-15 started to get, and while it was primarily marketed as like a hunting rifle, it then started being marketed as a self-defense tool that even the police really wanted to use during the war on drugs. And images just like this one not only really popularized the use of AR-15, but it started to again popularize the idea that we need more good guys with the guns to be able to stop the criminals and make our society safe. And while this way of thinking has always been intersected with the common debate about gun rights, people didn't mince their words now, especially when we talk about this key moment from the NRA convention in the late 1990s.
So, as we set out this year to defeat the divisive forces that would take freedom away, I want to say those fighting words for everyone within the sound of my voice. to hear and to heed, and especially for you, Mr. Gore. From my cold, dead hands.
And now to round up the 80s and 90s, we're going to be talking about some of the key gun control legislation that was passed. The first one being the Firearms Protection Act of 1986. This act, as well as other provisions on the other firearms acts in the past, allow less strict, guidelines for gun, sellers to do business when it comes to interstate commerce. Basically, it allows firearm dealers to be able to do business not at their address on their license. Basically saying if they want to partake in interstate commerce and all that, and they didn't want to have to do that within their own home or within their own business, then they could very well much do that. This act also prevented the federal government from having a national registry of firearms that weren't technically listed under the National Firearms Act. And yes, that includes semi-automatic handguns, in which that is why we were damned in the 30s when they didn't put that in the provision, but I digress. And another requirement that this act got rid of was that federal licensed dealers didn't have to track, ammunition purchases of individuals if they were non-armor piercing rounds. Now, I get that might not be a big deal for a lot of people, and that might seem like, ammunitions or regular ammunition is not that deadly. You consider the fact a lot of homicides and a lot of deaths happen due to non-piercing rounds, and so you will understand why this part of the act is very much headassery in my opinion, because now you allow federally licensed dealers to be engaged in private sales of not only of just guns but also of ammunition that they don't have to keep records of. But now we're going to switch gears to the Brady Handgun Act. This now required that federally licensed sales had to have a 5-day waiting period before the actual firearm or ammunition had to be transferred over to the person due to now conducting a background check for that said person. Now this 5-day waiting period has now been replaced by the national or instant background checking system, because ever since this act was implemented, more than 202 million background check have been implemented by the FBI since 1993. And many of them have saved many lives, especially when it comes to waiting periods, especially when it having red flags when it comes to gun owners or, gun buyers and all that. And definitely, it creates a sense of that, hey, now maybe it is still a good idea that we need to start restricting all guns in America and requiring that we have a national, universal background checking system. Key thing I want to continue mentioning in this video is that about only 40% of gun sellers are federally licensed or required to be federally licensed to sell, weapons, because they do interstate commerce as well as a lot of other private sales, meaning that most of the gun sellers in this country not only aren't federally licensed, but also they don't have to partake in this system, which you can see the problem. And the reason I keep bringing this up is not just because, it's because we are now having a secondary market of guns continuing to be overlooked, oversighted, and basically unrestricted because of not only just states' rights, but also too, we keep missing the mark when it comes to having a universal background check system. And much research has been done on this secondary market in guns, and it has stated that many individuals who are looking to do crime get these guns from the secondary market. And even though these laws have left a lot of federal oversight and a lot of loopholes that have not still been covered extensively today, the Federal Assault Ban Act of 1994 really takes the cake when it comes to the 1900s, because not only did it ban AR-15s, but it evaded a lot of other semi-automatic, weapons that were becoming more prevalent in the U.S., such as all the models of the AK, a lot of Uzis, as well as the AUG, for example. And as much research have said that this really didn't do much for overall gun violence in the country, and it had minimal, statistical effect of reducing gun violence in the country, there have been many findings that said that it has some statistical impact when it comes to mass unalive events that have taken place, in which one study has said there was a 70% reduction in mass fatalities that happened during mass unaliving events, and basically that was pretty much due to the federal assault ban of 1994. And yes, I get why a lot of people don't really like or really, think the federal assault ban made any sense, because most federal crimes, as well as most homicide crimes in the U.S., are conducted by handguns, which weren't covered during the assault ban. But when you consider the fact that the rise of mass unalivings have been taking place not only in the 80s, not only the 90s, but also it's exponentially expanded in the 2000s, then you will understand why this, federal assault ban has been statistically significant, because the type of weapons that was banned during this time were the main weapons that a lot of shooters used during these mass unaliving events. All right, so now we reached the 2000, which I don't need to tell you, it's been a wild decade or 2 decades. It's been a crazy, century, especially when you talk about not only the rise of more mass unaliving events, but also the rise of the cultural wars that we are seeing now. All right, so the first event I want to talk about is 9/11. Now, 9/11 was a tragic event all around, because pretty much it wasn't that the fact that we were just attacked, but in a way, the American facade or the American bubble of pride, prestige, and excellence was kind of popped, as well as that sense of invincibility was popped during not only Pearl Harbor but 9/11. And really, the war in Iraq, it kicked off the war in Afghanistan, as well as many other different campaigns in regards to fighting terrorism around the world. Now, there hasn't been widespread research discussing the long-term effects of gun ownership and gun sales due to 9/11, because pretty much we've had a lot of other historical events we've lived through just in the past 2 decades that really influenced gun, ownership rates. But the one thing that really kicked up a notch was how we marketed not only the AR-15, but how we marketed our military. Because like in the 80s, where the AR-15 started becoming more pro-police, ideology, pro-gun rights, we need to use this to defend our homes, defend our families, and all this. The AR-15 was starting to be pushed to be used by military men, to be used to go get the bad guys, and really expounding upon this good guy narrative that America loves to build up. Because not only Smith & Wesson and many other gun companies started promoting AR-15s with military men, going through Afghanistan, sweeping buildings, sweeping compounds, and really, attacking insurgents. But AR-15s and its variants had been featured prominently in violent video games. So as the 1994 assault ban, started to get lifted, but pretty much sales in AR-15 skyrocketed, as well as sales as in, violent video games such as Battlefield, Call of Duty started to skyrocket as well. And a lot of this was due to the post, 9/11 pro-war on terror movement. And pretty much the intersection between American gun culture, which includes AR-15s, as well as the intersection with violent video games, as well as pro-war sentiment, is ever more prevalent as more and more tactical and military attachments started to become available with, weapons, including the, scopes, including camouflage, as well as a lot of other different attachments and, things that you can really use to customize your weapons. To say if somebody wants to, cosplay as Captain Price from the Call of Duty series, then they will have some ability to do that. And really at this point, the gun companies are really just starting to eat up this gun culture and really just giving the American public what they want. And to some point, I really don't blame them. They're just there to make money. But they started to get, a little bit crazy with the marketing though, because not only only they're trying to market towards a pro-war sentiment, but they starting to intersect the gun culture with ideas of masculinity as well as religion. And to really highlight this notion, here's a picture of a senator, Senator Duckworth, basically holding up an ad or a tweet of an ad that was basically sent out a few weeks before the Uvalde shooting, which is nothing wrong on that onset. But when you consider the fact that this weapon was the same weapon that was used a few weeks later in Uvalde, where children were unalived, then you understand why this is very much a problem. But basically, our gun culture has been continuously being intersected with political figures. Like, I kid you not, I've saw multiple ads with Marjorie Taylor Greene firing off a firearm for 2 weeks straight, whether it be on YouTube or on TV. And I kid you not, that is very much, an image I don't want to look at. Past 2 decades of using these images to promote a gun culture where we see guns not necessarily as a tool, but as if they're the new Ferrari that, you just have to have or you aspire to get, then you will understand why we not only have seen a surge in sales of AR-15s after the federal ban was lifted, but also we've seen a massive surge in firearms in general, especially during the 2020, COVID pandemic and elections. Not only that, there's been more and more, encroachment by the gun lobby, including the NRA as well as the NSSF, which is starting to eclipse the NRA in many cases. They, as well as the rest of the gun lobby, has spent hundreds of millions of dollars to not only just encroach on our elections, but they have essentially made it even hard to even get common sense gun laws on the books because they have bought off so many politicians. And to really break down how much gun hysteria has really taken over the US, let's look at the gun purchase rates whenever it comes to major events, when it comes to elections, when it comes to, mass unalivings, as well as it comes to like very much historical events like 9/11. Because when you look at this study, you look at the different gun buyer rates as well as, the different perceptions on why people decided to buy a gun in the first place, whether it's for actual safety or it was just due to out of fear that, the government was going to restrict us, like how we, have guns. And basically, when you look at every event other than what went down in 2020 and 2021 with the insurrection, the reason most people decided to buy a gun wasn't out of fear of actual safety. It was more so due to the perception they thought the governments were coming to restrict their guns and to eventually take their weapons. And to really break down other narratives that go hand in hand with this type of thinking in the US, we really need to talk about the perceptions we have on entertainment, especially when you talk about rap culture as well as video game culture. I think at some point we do need to have a conversation about how much, this violence in video games really affect our perception on, gun culture and like pro-American culture and all that. I'm not going to sit here and just say that people are committing crimes or people are committing mass unalivings because they played 10 hours straight of Call of Duty or it's a whole day of Battlefield or Warzone or whatever. Because at the end of the day, I use the same argument for video games as I use for rap and hip hop culture. As in the fact that most people commit, devious things, not because they really looked at devious media or any like that. They're more likely to commit devious things or crimes or mass unalivings due to their social environments. But I do want to say that the way that we personify, we glamorize, and we glorify violent video games to the point that we literally make market and we literally make bank off of it, it does at some point change our perception on how we talk about real life issues when it comes to gun control and gun violence. Because I've known a lot more people who are very much into that first person shooter culture to be more hesitant and be more irate whenever you mention, gun control. Now let's talk more about rap and hip hop culture and how it has been elevated more into the mainstream media. Now I'm not going to miss any words on this. I do agree that there has been a lot more violence as well as crime mentioned in the lyrics of rap songs than there has been at any point of US history. Like, I'm not missing any words on that. I agree with many conservatives on that point. And while I still stand by the fact that most people commit crimes due to their social conditions rather than listening to like what they hear on a morning radio show, there is a sense of misperception when it comes to talking about gun violence in Black communities and like how much it has been, looked over. Because with Black gun violence, I feel like there's more of a tendency to really talk about gun violence from an individual perspective in the black community. Basically, whenever we talk about, drive-bys in the quote-unquote hood or, black children dying in the streets, basically we often, and what I mean by we, I'm also talking about black people as well, we often talk about it as, man, the black community ain't doing right. We need to get more involved in our community. We need to pull ourselves up and, do better for ourselves. In which, don't get me wrong, I definitely agree with everything except the bootstrap politics talking point many, black conservatives like to push out, as well as like white and liberal audiences. But one thing I want to mention that we often don't talk about when we talk about black gun violence is that we don't really associate it with gun control. Whereas if, Sandy Hook would have happened, again, or if you want to talk about crimes that happen in suburbia and all that, white people are more generally often, to associate a lot of that, not just with community, needs or community, action, but by associating with a lack of gun control, which I agree with. And white people are very much valid in bringing that up. But oftentimes we don't give that type of talking point for black gun violence because oftentimes we just put it or phrase it in a way that this is just another day in a quote unquote hood. Yes, you can change the environment. Yes, you can give, black youth more educational resources, more investment, more love, care, basically giving them more support. But if we don't really change the shape of gun culture as well as like gun control in black communities, as well as all communities in America, then gun violence is not going to change. There's another double standard we're starting to call out, which is the double standard of gun glorification between black and white bodies. Now, I'm gonna bring up Ja Morant, and I'm not gonna ridicule this man what he's already done. If you want to look at that, go look at Stephen A. Smith or go look at Shannon Sharp's, take on it. Like, I'm not gonna do that to this guy. The point I want to bring up with Ja Morant's story and how much the media has ridiculed him in the past, few months over his antics is really hypocritical when you look at the fact that not only you had a lot of conservative as well white people posting up with guns on a daily basis in their campaign ads, as well as in their Christmas photos, as well as just the regular selfies on Twitter and all that. But basically a lot of people really don't give them a time of day. Like, yes, there might be some outrage to it, but there hasn't been no media gang up like we've seen with Ja Morant, situation. And to really simplify and make sure you don't get lost in the sauce, this is the same thing that we do to black and brown, boys and girls as we criminalize them, bastardize them, and basically chew them out for participating in like rap culture and crimes and all that. But we don't do the same thing when we talk about rich white suburban kids who get caught up in that lifestyle and pretty much oftentimes get swept under the rug. And it's just one of those things where it's just like, that's not okay. All right, now let's go over the legislation that has already been passed this century, including the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act and Child Safety Lock Act of 2005, in which this act, signed over by George W. Bush, allowed for broad civil liability immunity to all firearms manufacturers so they cannot be sued a family of a gun violence victim. While this act explicitly states that this only affects federally licensed dealers, this also affects entities that are in the business of selling firearms at a retail or personal level. And this is a problem for many reasons, because when it comes to like lawsuits, a lot of it is based on legal fact, but also a lot of it is also based on subjective opinion. And subjectively, you can really just make the argument that many licensed dealers as well as arms and ammunition sellers don't know, or they aren't responsible directly with an individual's firearms death. At the end of the day, I still think it leaves too much of a gray area to be like, okay, yeah, you didn't directly cause this event, but at the end of the day, there's no, justifiable reason you should be selling this much ammunition or this amount of firepower to one individual in multitude of sales, But some of the good things that this act did is now that it requires that all handguns be sold with a secure gun storage or safety device, as well as both arm manufacturers and dealers can still be held liable for damages resulting from defective products, breach of contract, criminal misconduct on the hand of the businesses, as well as other actions for which they are directly responsible for. Like, if they were to know that, let's say I sold a, handgun to an individual and I knew that they were going to be involved in a mass, unaliving, then hey, I'm still held liable in civil as well as federal court that I should have done something and told the authorities sooner, But nonetheless, this was still a victory for the gun lobby. So much so that about 33 other states at the time of this recording have adopted similar laws according to this act, allowing for broad immunity at the local and state level. Now, also under the Bush's administration, the National Instant Criminal Background Checking System Improvement Act was enacted as a condition under the Brady Act. And this act was created to add more of an incentive for states to actually use the background system and to really, do their due diligence whenever they're doing, gun background checks. For example, trying to get more states and more, authorities to upload information about individuals who shouldn't be having weapons, such as people with severe mental health issues, as well as convicted felons. And a lot of this was in response due to the Virginia Tech shooting that happened that year, because pretty much the shooter wasn't supposed to have a weapon because they had a mental health adjudication, or there was some like system flagging his mental health that wasn't uploaded in time of his purchase. And so because of that, now they're trying to have more of an emphasis on like, hey, we need more people to like not only upload stuff to the system, but also we need to have more, due diligence with it. Even though that's just one example of a shooting that could have been prevented, that still could have been like a multitude of people that could be alive to this day to be able to, enjoy life. Now, going towards the Obama administration, there has been a multitude of things and executive orders that Obama did throughout his time to really, shore up not only the gun control as well as the NICS system, but also the way that we treat mental health. And some of those things were an update and expansion of the background checking system, which is trying to close the gun show loophole that I had explained earlier in this video. The addition of 200 ATF agents, increased mental health care funding, and about $4 million in personnel to enhance the National Integrated Ballistic Information System, which is the Department of Health and Human Services, to report a mental health, concern or adjudication towards the NICS system. Because usually a lot of times mental health as well as a lot of health, information is private due to HIPAA. But at the end of the day, when you're dealing with something like, gun control and all that, you need to make sure you're able to get as much information about a person to make sure to bar themselves. And while I'm not saying we should just stereotype and, really, clamp down on people with mental illnesses and weapons, but at the end of the day, if they have a severe history of mental health, they should not be holding a gun. Not only that, he also invested about $500 million into increase the access to mental health care, new research funding for gun safety technologies, as well as more funding to train law enforcement officers on preventing gun casualties when it comes to domestic violence disputes. Which these are all good, because this is not only just focusing on one part of the industry, which is solely just the guns, but really this is like a whole community approach of just approaching gun violence, because there's a lot of social determinants factors, adverse experiences a lot of like adults as well as children have that cause them to act out with gun violence that we need to address, as well as the fact it's also a mental health concern. And so at the end of the day, I liked his approach because it wasn't just one issue, it was like a multitude of issues that we need to figure out. And while it still didn't come, close to being able to completely solve the issue of gun violence, it was at least a good start that was often rolled back due to the Trump administration. Now, to just name a few things that Trump did, because he did a lot. Basically, the administration in 2017 rolled back a regulation implemented under Obama's administration, which would prohibit approximately about 75,000 people from ever being reported in the NICS system for receiving Social Security benefits for mental health services. I can see the sense why people applaud him for doing that, because like I said a few seconds ago, oftentimes we stigmatize people with mental health issues, and oftentimes we think they're going to be the most violent people in the world, but yet they oftentimes are they make them the most victims of violence. Now, with that being said, Trump has also done a ton of other stuff that really is, putting us at risk. And one of those things is basically narrowing the definition of what a fugitive of law consists of. And so basically the specific definition that Trump chose to narrow down to was being or requiring that an individual leave a state with the specific intent to avoid prosecution. And I know a lot of people want to sit here and ask, like, what's the big whoop about this? Like, you can still catch criminals. Yes, but pretty much it makes it a lot more easier for criminals to just straight up and lie, because intent can be very subjective. Like a criminal pursuing or leaving a state after, skipping bail or, skipping a trial date or something. Basically, he could have been like, oh, I have a family emergency. My mom got cancer and I got to go. Or, I have to be somewhere else, I have child support to take care of, I need to be in that state to take care of my child, whatever. Like, intent is so subjective to the point where it's just like this narrow definition honestly will probably mean nothing. And we consider the fact that Trump did this unlawfully, because whenever you're supposed to make changes, you're actually supposed to not only tell the organization you're making the changes for, but you also have to allow a period for public comment to address these changes. Then you can understand that he's really not in a state of mind to really be making decisions on like who and who shouldn't have, rights to guns. And to really add fuel to the fire, Trump not only changed that definition without lawfully telling anybody or going through the lawful process or legal proceedings, but Trump also purged at least 50,000 documents from the system that would have been, disqualified due to the change in definition. Not only that, he proposed to slash about 16% of the budget that will allow states to actually upload those type of documents to the system. And we're not talking about DMV records. We're not talking about, a license to have a business or whatever. We're actually talking about licenses or records to bar people from owning weapons, such as convicted felons, such as people with mental health adjudications, as well as a lot of people who are barred under federal law to own a weapon. And when you consider the fact there are more mass unalive events that are taking place every day, then you understand that this is something that, will really set us back years, to what we've really built up with the NICS system. And while this is the tip of the iceberg of what Trump has done while elected president, and hopefully his only time serving as president, one can hope, we need to get to Biden. Because under the direction of President Biden, Congress was able to sign the Bipartisan Safe Communities Act of 2022. Because not only does this act allowed enhanced reviews for buyers under 21 trying to buy from a federal dealer, it also invested more than $500 million into many different crisis prevention programs, and as well as extreme risk protection orders to make sure that individuals that are not supposed to have weapons or pose a danger to themselves or loved ones should get their weapons barred. And not only that, President Biden has recently signed a slew of different executive orders on gun control, including one that requires that all federal background checks should be conducted before a sale, making sure that all individuals buying the weapons are able to have weapons and are not barred from those weapons. Including one that would require that all federal background checks be done before the purchases of firearms, as well as the fact it increases public awareness on red flag laws, because while red flag laws are prominent in many states, many individuals don't know about this law, including law enforcement agents as well as regular everyday people. And this has shown up in many instances where many states that have red flag laws have reported low, orders being issued, because a lot of individuals frankly don't know about this, or a lot of individuals, including law enforcement, are hesitant to pursue these orders because of the danger they pose. Now, I know this has been very much a long video, and I applaud y'all for watching it through, but at the end of the day, gun violence as well as gun control isn't a very much recent issue, but it's a very much complicated issue with many different, progresses as well as setbacks. But the one thing I really want to hit home in this video is that the US has always had violence at the center of its society. Because just to name a few instances, we've had the Picoy massacre, we've had incidents such as Bloody Monday, we've had instances such as the New York draft riots, we've had instances such as the Fort Pillow massacre. We have incidences such as the Sand Creek massacre. We have the first recorded school mass unaliving in the Bass school disaster. Basically in Badtown, Michigan, a school board member detonated explosives, killing not only 38 elementary school children, but also 6 adults and himself, which makes this one of the most deadliest school unalivings in the nation. And it hasn't even been the 100th anniversary of this. We've had violence in restaurants. We've had violence in places of worship. We've had violence in places where we seek entertainment, violence in places where we just go to shop. We've had violence in grocery stores. Even a few weeks ago in Virginia, there was a mass shooting at a graduation celebration. And even as the U.S. has so much violence perpetrated on its own soil, We've had many different incidences where we perpetrated violence during many wars, during coups, as well as during times of peace. And recently in my social and professional circles, whenever we talk about gun violence and gun control, I always bring up the fact that the U.S. public has only recently started discussing this issue of violence in the U.S. when in actuality, the U.S. has always been a violent place. It's just the fact that it only affected a certain group of people or certain groups of people that were deemed unimportant, that no one really batted an eye until instances such as Columbine or even the UT Tower shooting started happening. The U.S. and its people have used violence as a proponent for many different ideologies, such as racism, such as sexism, such as, xenophobia, whether it's to upkeep and expand capitalism, to uphold and expand imperialism abroad. And we as Americans not only love violence so much, but we are often starting to trivialize it to a point where we don't think it's even worth learning. I.e. all the debate that's going on about Black history as well as LGBTQIA plus histories, in schools. And not only has violence been used as the ideology means to an end, but there is a lot of startling statistic on interpersonal as well as, personal violence. Because as it sits right now, as well as in recent years, nearly half of all women killed in the U.S. are murdered by a current or former intimate partner, which women are 5 times more likely to be murdered when their abuser has access to a weapon. Unintentional or accidental shootings still remain one of the highest causes of gun violence, unalivings in the U.S. per year, as well as there are more self-deletions than actual murders in the U.S., especially when it comes to males. And by using the recent small arms survey, which took place in 2017, the U.S. citizens own almost 400 million firearms, in which is almost nearly 100 times as many firearms as the U.S. military and nearly 400 times as many as law enforcement. And this figure doesn't even include the spike that took place during COVID. And to really put things into perspective, more people and more Americans have died to gun violence at the hands to other American citizens, as well as to lackluster protections we have in our system, than, let's say, people have died from terrorism. Which is the reason why we've had 2 wars in the past 20 years. Not only that, self-defense, which is the reason why many gun lobbyists and as well as gun rights advocate, really harp on that we really need to protect the Second Amendment and, try not to restrict it as much as possible, especially when it comes to having common sense gun laws. We still on average have a lot less gun uses when it comes to self-defense than when it comes to unalivings, self-deletions, as well as gun crime. And yes, defensive gun uses have many different definitions and many different, meanings when it comes to different people, such as it could have been shots fired or it could have been used to threaten criminals with a gun, which is subjective in itself. But by looking at the verifiable numbers that have been verified by the FBI, there is no practical reason why we should use self-defense or the good guy narrative to continually not pass common sense gun legislation. And now we come to the video where I talk about what do I think needs to be done. And in my personal opinions, when I talk about common sense gun laws, I'm including the universal ban of assault weapons or any long guns that have military variants. Because while I've said that handguns have been the most used, weapons when it comes to gun violence incidences, assault weapons are still continually being used in mass shootings incidences. And there's a reason for it. These types of weapons aren't made for hunting, nor are they made for you to defend your home with. These weapons are meant to unalive and destroy literally anything that you are targeting in the fastest way possible. And I can guarantee you that if the founding fathers had some sense of foresight or had some type of crystal ball, they can look into the future and see what type of weapons that this country is able to produce at this time, I will guarantee you they would not have signed the Second Amendment, because the Second Amendment wasn't meant for you to cosplay as your favorite Call of Duty soldier and, to go to the range or play paintball with. The Second Amendment means that you have the basic means to protect yourself, and that does not include these military style weapons. Another common sense law that we need to institute is that we need to have a universal background checking system, not only at the federal level, not only at the state level, but at the local level. Because from time and time again, we have allowed unrestricted access of weapons to not only get into the hands of law-abiding citizens, but also into the hands of organized crimes as well as basic criminals. And in my opinion, I don't think these law-abiding, quote-unquote, gun rights advocates and lobbyists should have a problem with the average citizen from having a 2-week background check. Like, I think that's the least that they can do for getting a weapon that could be used in a crime or unaliving or whatever. There need to be a universal permit carry system for all gun owners in America, because as we see more and more states trying to implement this permitless carry system within their borders, we are starting to see more and more instances of gun violence rises in these states. And while I'm not trying to say there's a direct link between permitless carry as well as the prevalence of violence happening in their states, we shouldn't make it easier for an individual who would like to do something nefarious be able to carry around a gun. Like, that is basic common sense. Not only should we do all this, we should also make it a lot harder for individuals to stockpile weapons and ammunitions, i.e. by allowing only one gun purchase as well as a limited stock of ammunition per 6 months. As well as institute a strategy we did for big tobacco, i.e. not only heavily taxing firearms and their ammunitions, but also the attachments that you can buy with them, and then use that money to not only fund mental health services and advocacy, but also gun violence prevention programs such as gun education, as well as safe storage, laws and all that. And my last big suggestion when it comes to gun control, let's actually federalize the red flag law system by not only expanding the powers of ATF, the FBI, and a lot of other law enforcement to be able to coordinate with local law enforcement to enact and, to carry out these red flag laws, but also have a red flag law training program to actually teach people what red flag law is for, and basically to reduce the stigma that comes with it. As well as we outlaw the ideas that state counties can become Second Amendment sanctuaries, which outlaw as well as not enact or enforce the idea of red flags laws. Now, in conjunction with all these laws, I think that we should also have a national gun buyback program. Now, there have been many models that have been instituted in the past few years that have some evidence of working, such as the one in Australia as well as a recent one in Serbia. And as especially the one in Australia has seen a great reduction in gun self-deletions ever since the law was instituted, I think it's worth a shot to put here, or at least try in the US. And if hypothetically all these laws were instituted, which I will highly doubt because of the gun lobby and all that, we should also hypothetically get rid of broad immunity when it comes to the gun lobby as well as gun buying industry. Because as we are now hypothetically restricting gun owners as well as, gun dealers from allowing gun owners to stockpile, I think there should be more accountability on the hands of gun sellers as well as gun companies, as hypothetically we are trying to prevent people from trying to stockpile in an event they are doing a mass unaliving, in my personal opinion. And not only will we hypothetically get rid of broad immunity, we will also hypothetically restrict on how much the gun lobby can spend during elections. Because in a common sense society, a gun corporation nor our gun lobbyists should be able to buy their way into Congress by paying politicians to not vote for common sense gun laws. Now, to go away from guns for a second, other laws I will institute would be shoring up the mental health system and making sure they have a lot more social investment than what they're getting in now. And that wouldn't just be building more systems or infrastructure to house mental health patients or to treat mental health, illnesses and, symptoms and all that. But pretty much we would actually shore up the mental health workforce, for example, by having a loan repayment system, which will allow mental health experts, social workers, as well as college students be able to work in the field without having fear of defaulting on their loans. And while I'm not an expert in the field of mental health, I am a public health professional. And even as I've only been working my full-time job for 1 year, I have seen the vast amount of underfunding, not only in our field, not only in the mental health field, but in general in our social infrastructure that we so desperately need. And to really round out these lists of suggestions, we can have gun control, we can have mental health reform, we can have public health reform, but at the end of the day, if America doesn't confront its violent past as well as history, unglamorized, that at the end of the day is going to continue to repeat upon itself and affect more individuals, especially in marginalized populations. And if I had one wish that could be granted today, I wish that we could institute DEIA as well as all history, not just white history, but black, brown, LGBTQIA plus, all histories of all American people into the public education system. And while I can't speak for all marginalized groups in America, I can speak as a black man in America. It makes no sense why I couldn't learn my entire history until I got to college, when I had to actually start paying for my education. It makes no sense and it's very counterproductive, and it doesn't make us better as a nation. And so to really end this video off, one of the biggest moments from my childhood was Sandy Hook. Now, while my family and I weren't directly impacted by the shooting, I remember vividly what that day was. Basically, 12-year-old me just came home from school. I had just completed my Christmas list, and basically we had just got Mickey D's, and pretty much as I sat on the couch and turned on to the news, that's when I actually realized what had taken place earlier that day. And while I had watched the news from the age of 7 and up and knew that, you know, human beings can be cruel and can do unspeakable things, that was the first time that it really just stuck with me, because pretty much these weren't just adults that were in the building, or that these were just soldiers that had just died in Iraq or Afghanistan during the war. These victims were children who, like me, were just going to school like it was just an average Friday, and luckily I was able to come home, but unfortunately they weren't able to come home. And especially that hits harder as we're reaching the 11th year of Sandy Hook, because it's not the fact that I really vividly imagine that day every week. Pretty much that day still hits close to home pretty much every time I see a mass unaliving that takes place pretty much every day in the US now. We're really going to address the violence that is going on in our nation, then we really need to address our violent past. Because like I said throughout this video, the US has been founded, the US has expanded, and the US has been preserved on violence, and it needs to change. And by all means, I'm not an expert on guns. I'm not an expert on violence. I don't want this video to be seen as this groundbreaking documentary or this hot take, you know, how do we solve the issues of the world? But I at least want this video to at least make you think somewhat differently about how we talk about gun violence as well as the violence in our nation. And so with that being said, I hope you found this video very informational, as well as it can pertain to some aspect of your work or your life. If you would like to see more video commentary in this style, please let me know. I'm always open to feedback, as well as I want to push this channel to be the best and be the most helpful for you. Please continue to support the channel as well as my other content. And as I said in the beginning, this is probably one of the most darkest topics I've covered in the history of my channel. And so if you made it all the way through the video, please go take care of yourself. You deserve it. As well as stay warm, stay frosty, depending on what part of the country you're in, and peace out.